Hello, beloved! Welcome back. This is part two of talking about queer sexuality things with Byron. Yeah, we're just going to dive into Bible things. This lecture that I'm essentially giving in multiple parts takes me a minimum of an hour and a half to talk about in any kind of detail, just as a one-sided lecture. I prefer 3 hours, frankly, to talk about these things. So we'll just dive in. This is my favorite Bible. This is the Jerusalem Bible. My father gave this to me for my 20th birthday, and I love it. It's a very fiery translation. J.R.R. Tolkien is one of the editors, so I like that. It's got great notes on some of the, and introductions and things. On some of the more theological pages, it's got half a page at the bottom of just notes and stuff. So this is Hebrews, so this is text and stuff, and then these are all notes about just these pages. So I love it. We're gonna start with Sodom and Gomorrah. So Genesis 19. I've memorized so much of this. Also, I've studied this and been really in-depth with these things for years and years and years. I've read a lot of books. Some books I would highly recommend. Bible, Gender, Sexuality by Dr. James Bronson is really the best. It goes through kind of theological ideas, and it's not just kind of a tit-for-tat clobber passage arguments. If you want that, there's some really good ones out there. Torn by Justin Lee is where I started. It gave me the courage to come out, have some basic stuff to talk with my parents about. God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines is really great. Transforming by Austin Hartke is good for trans things and the place of those with faith in the Bible. What else? I got some of them here. Gushy. There's a book by Gushy called Changing Our Mind. Anything else? There's a lot out there. And they've got pros and cons. I'm just gonna go through some of my thoughts. A lot of this is to them. Citations are hard. I'll try to acknowledge where my ideas come from, but that's kind of hard. So Genesis 19, this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the first clobber passage that most people kind of turn to as just a form of saying hey, it's not okay to do gay things. What I'm going to do as I go through these clobber passages, what sometimes people do is they go through and they're this is why this is completely irrelevant to gay stuff. And I prefer not necessarily to go that route because, frankly, I think it is much more insidious than that. It's not that these things are necessarily completely irrelevant to gay things, right? When Paul talks about men did things with men, that's obviously connected to same-sex intercourse. So I'm not saying that these things are irrelevant. I'm saying that they are probably, according to the culture and the history and things, far more relevant to something else. Most usually idolatry, but also things like misogyny, things like slavery even. And I think actually one of the cruelest turns of it has been one of the cruelest turns of the devil in this discussion, to take something that should be a don't rape people verse and a don't treat women poorly verse and acknowledge the dignity of people caught in prostitution kind of verse, and for those to be not only for those parts of it to be ignored and shoved to the side, but in fact for them to be weaponized against LGBTQ plus folks. So I guess it's also important for me to say a little bit about my perception of the Bible in general. Again, as I said, I take the Bible extraordinarily seriously, and that means understanding it for what it is and also what it isn't. so if I call it a book written by people thousands of years ago for a different culture at a different time, like, it is that. That doesn't mean that it's not also God's words given to us as believers in general. I will constantly maintain against anyone that the Bible is, that Jesus is the whole point of everything in the Bible. The Old Testament all points to Jesus, and the New Testament all points to Jesus. And anything that doesn't is either misinterpreted by us or historical or like important for us to know for some other reasons. My personal beliefs about like Genesis and things, like I believe that everything before like Genesis 12 is mythopoetical. I have really good reasons for that, culturally speaking, and linguistically speaking. I don't speak Greek yet or Hebrew as like a whole language, but I've done a ton of word studies for important words. So yeah, it is like God. Jesus is God's word, capital W, word, logos. Right, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We don't say in the beginning was the Bible, and the Bible was with God, and the Bible was God. That's gross. That's like blasphemy. Also, I don't think that the Bible is. I mean, this is really tangential, but it's really important to like you understanding where I'm coming from and my faith and things. Yeah, I mean, it is the words that God chose to communicate to us. They are holy. They are, I'm sure they were intended to be infallible. I would love to know exactly what the original texts said and have the, original mind to interpret them. But through translation, through lots of things, like and even just as finite humans, like there's a lot for us to misinterpret. Also, I guess it's super important to just say that anything that leads to harm is probably, any interpretation that leads to harm is probably not God's desire. Yeah. That shouldn't be too hard to wrap your head around. I mean, the question of, like, what counts as harm is, like, really important, but I think most of the time it's pretty obvious. Okay. So Genesis. This is hard. Yeah, and not everyone will agree with this. Part of this is all just like for me to keep records and things. But we're actually gonna start talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and I'm sure I'm gonna miss so much stuff. I'm sure I already have like mentioned some things and then gone off on like tangents. Sodom and Gomorrah. Here we go. No more pausing. It's chapter 19. We're actually going to start at chapter 18, the apparition at Mamre. So, context here, God has called a dude named Abraham and given him a son and told him to follow certain rules and promised him that he will have descendants that will like rule this whole area. His nephew Lot goes off and because they have a little bit of a squabble, Lot goes off to the better land, and Abraham is like, cool, I'll chill here, I guess. So at some point, I'll just read this whole thing. These are going to be long videos anyway, deal with it. Yahweh appeared to him, this is Genesis 18. Yahweh appeared to him, Abraham, at the oak of Mamre, while he was sitting by the entrance of the tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. I'm going to pull a expositional preaching style here and like stop and explain things. So 3 men, wonderful Trinitarian metaphor, way before the idea of the Trinity ever was like really conceived. There's ideas that develop in the Bible, which is to me a huge indicator that like a lot of it is interpretable. So like when Israel wrestles with the angel, it also says he wrestled with God. So this angel is God, or like this angel is channeling God. Like it's just an early understanding of how God related to God's people. So I mean, in this you kind of see this idea that it's like God with 2 angels. Well, the idea of an angel isn't super solidified until a little bit later, as like a messenger who's distinct from God, the Godhead. Okay, so 3 people come up, stand near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to meet them. I'm keeping track of a couple important facts here. Bowed to the ground. My lord, he said, I beg you, if you find favor with you, kindly do not pass your servant by. A little water will be brought, and we shall wash your feet. And please lie down under this tree. Let me fetch a little bread, and refresh yourselves before going further. That is why you have come to your servant's direction. That is why you have come to your servant's direction. They replied, okay, do as you say. Abraham hastened to the tent to find Sarah. Hurry, he said, need 3 bushels of flour to make loaves. That's a lot of flour. Then, running to the cattle, Abraham took a fine and tender calf. So he feeds them. They tell her... that Sarah is going to have a baby. This is confusing because this is post-Ishmael, right? I told you I'm not going to edit this out. I'm just reading the Bible. So Ishmael's around. Yeah, okay. So God's promise, Abraham got impatient and tried to do it his own way. And so then they tried to have a baby through Abraham's servant. But God was like, anyway, you'll have a baby and call him Isaac. So these angels kind of confirm the story, and Sarah laughs. So Abraham goes, and the story continues. Sorry, I should have just read it. It'd be faster than explaining that in my very cluttered way. So, verse 16, Genesis 18. From there the men set out and arrived in sight of Sodom, with Abraham accompanying them to show them the way. Now Yahweh had wondered, shall I conceal from Abraham what I'm going to do, seeing that Abraham will become a great nation, and with all the nations of the earth blessing themselves by him. Already Jesus things, yay! For I have singled him out to command his sons and his household after him to maintain the way that Yahweh by just and upright living. Okay, so they went down. 2 of the angels went down, while Abraham remained standing with Yahweh. And Abraham says, "Are you really going to destroy the just man with the sinner?" So, okay, that's not super important. Abraham and God haggle down to how few people, because his nephew lives there now, and he's like, "I don't really want you to destroy good people if they're can you save the bad people too?" Okay, moving on. 19. That introduction is important because Middle East things again. The idea of hospitality here is actually what's super, super important, and that might not seem super compelling to a Western ear, but having grown up in the Middle East, the idea of hospitality is of critical importance. And so those seven-ish things will come up again. Just listen for them. So 19. When the 2 angels reached Sodom in the evening, Lot was sitting at the gate. As soon as Lot saw them there, he rose to meet them and bowed to the ground. "I beg you, my lords, please come down to your servant's house and stay the night." I think that's one of them. "Wash your feet. In the morning you can continue your journey." Oh, I'm missing food and water. There we go. So he pressed them so much that they went with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking unleavened bread, and they ate. Here's the important part. The rest of this was tangential. This is the core of why people think this has anything to do with homosexuality. "So they had not gone to bed when the house was surrounded by the men of the town. The men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people without exception, calling to Lot, without exception, a whole town of them, called to Lot and said, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Send them out to us so that we may abuse them.'" King James Version says that we may know them. They're saying they want to have sex with them. This isn't just sex, this is violent gang rape. So we'll keep going. Lot came out to them at the door, and having closed the door behind him, said, I beg you, my brothers, do no such wicked thing. Listen, I have 2 daughters who are virgins. Oh boy, I am ready to send them out to you, and to treat as it pleases you. But as for the men, do nothing to them, for they have come under the shadow of my roof. But they replied, Out of the way. Here is one who came as a foreigner, and would set himself up as a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them. Oh boy. Then they forced Lot back and moved forward to break down the door. But the men reached out, pulling Lot back into the house, and shut the door. The angel men. And they struck the men who were at the door of the house with blindness from youngest to oldest, and they never found the doorway. The angels then saved the city. Or not the city, the family of Lot, minus his daughter's sodomite husbands. Cool. Before I come back and full commentary on stuff, I'm gonna jump to the book of Judges 19, and we're gonna see something. 19, the Levite of Ephraim and his concubine. Cool. Don't know if you've ever heard this story before. I hadn't before I started researching this stuff. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, there was a man, a Levite, whose home was deep in the highlands of Ephraim. He took as a concubine a woman from Bethlehem in Judah. In a fit of anger, his concubine left him and returned to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and she stayed there for some 4 months. Her husband set out to visit her, to reason with her and fetch her back. He had his servant and 2 donkeys with him, and as they approached the house of the girl's father, the father saw him and came very joyful to meet him. This is weird. His father-in-law, the father of the girl, made him his guest. He stayed with him for 3 days. They ate and drank and spent the night there. On the 4th day they got up early, and the Levite was preparing to leave when the girl's father said to his son-in-law, Have a bite of food to fortify yourself. You can leave later. So they sat down and began eating and drinking, the 2 of them together, and the girl's father said to the young man, Come, say you will spend tonight here too, and enjoy yourself. And when the man got up to leave, the father-in-law pressed him again to spend another night. On the 5th morning, the Levite, so hospitality is the theme here. Eat something first, I beg you. 5th morning, whatever. So they whiled away their time, and as the day began to decline, the 2 of them ate together. The husband was preparing to leave with his concubine and his servant, when his father-in-law, the father of the girl, said to him, Look, the day is drawing towards evening. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow you can set off to your tent. But the man would not stay the night there. He got up and set off and came within the sight of Jebus. Not Jesus, Jebus. That is Jerusalem. He had with him 2 donkeys saddled with his concubine and his servant. So the context of this story is already hospitality, in the same way that the context of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was already hospitality. We're talking Abraham's hospitality as a foreshadowing of Lot's. We're talking this father-in-law's hospitality as a foreshadowing of this next part. So verse 11, By the time they were near Jerusalem, the day was fast going. The servant said to his master, Please let us leave the road now and enter this Jebusite town and spend the night there. His master answered, We will not enter a town of foreigners, that's important to note, of people who are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah instead. He went on to say to his servants, Come on, we will try to reach one or other of those places, either Gibeah or Ramah, and spend the night there. So they kept on continuing their journey. As they approached Gibeah in Benjamin, the town tribe of Benjamin, the sun was already setting. So they turned that way to spend the night in Gibeah, inside the town. The Levite sat down in the middle of the public square, but no one offered to take them into his house for the night. Oh, not a huge issue to Westerners, I guess. We suck at hospitality, and we're already pretty xenophobic and stuff. This is shocking for Israelite town. An old man came their way who was returning at nightfall from his work in the fields. He was a man from the highlands of Ephraim, and a foreigner resident in Gibeah, like Lot was in Sodom. The men of the place being Benjamites. Raising his eyes, he saw the traveler sitting in the public square of the town. The old man asked him, Where have you come from? Where are you going? The other answered, "We are on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a place deep in the highlands of Ephraim. That is where I come from. I have been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I am going home. But no one has offered to take me into his house. Although we have straw and provender for our donkeys, and I have bread and wine as well for myself and this maidservant and the young man who is traveling with your servant. We are short of nothing." The old man answered, "Welcome to you. Let me see all of your needs. You cannot spend the night in the public square." So he took them into his house and gave the donkeys food. The travelers washed their feet and ate and drank. So a couple of the signifiers of before. As they were at their cheerful meal, some men from the town, scoundrels, came crowding together round the house. They battered on the door and said to the old man, the master of the house, "Send out the man who has come into your house that we may abuse him." Same word. That we may rape him. Then the master of the house went out to them and said, "No, my brothers, I implore you, do not commit this crime. This man has become my guest. Do not commit such an infamy." Is there a note here? Yeah. "Here is my daughter. She is a virgin. I will give her to you. Possess her. Do what you please with her, but do not commit such an infamy against this man." The men would not listen to him, so the Levite took his concubine and brought her... Ugh, so this is disgusting already. We'll get back more to this in a second. The men would not listen to him, so the Levite took his concubine and brought her out to them. They had intercourse with her and outraged her all night till morning. When dawn was breaking, they let her go. At daybreak, the girl came and fell on the threshold of her husband's host, and she stayed there till it was full day. In the morning, her husband got up and opened the door of the house. He was coming out to continue his journey when he saw the woman who had been his concubine lying on the floor of the house with her hands on the threshold. Oh my gosh, this is awful. He said to her, "Stand up, we must go." There was no answer. Then he laid her across his donkey and began the journey home. Having reached his house, he picked up his knife, took hold of his concubine, and limb by limb cut her into 12 pieces. Then he sent her all throughout the land of Israel. He instructed his messengers as follows: "This is what you are to say to all the Israelites. Has any man seen such a thing from the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt until this very day? Ponder this. Discuss it. Then give your verdict." And all who saw it declared, "Never has such a thing been done since Israel came out of Egypt." So this is something that eventually leads to the destruction of essentially the entire tribe of Benjamin for this crime. Let's dig into this a little bit. As Matthew Vines really likes to say often, drawing the comparison, the only thing that I, as a bisexual man, am ever, tempted to or, drawn to is love. Consensual, for me, monogamous, co-power, love. Is this verse making a negative comment on that? Not to mention, was that even possible during ancient times? Hell no. For plenty of reasons, most of them coming down to patriarchy and power and things. I hope I don't miss out on any, important facts and things, but this is such a huge concept. So, this is a really disturbing story, both of them. Genesis 19 and also Judges 19. We're going to go through it back again and point out what this story is, actually about. From Genesis 18 and 19, we see this parallel story. And that is one... Oh, by the way, Genesis is before Leviticus, so, before there were any, laws about gay stuff. We'll reach into Leviticus 18 and 20 in a second. That'll be our next video. So, what is going on here? We know we're dealing with a culture that is deeply patriarchal, for one, but also deeply, deeply committed to the idea of hospitality. You kind of need to be, just as a form of general, living, because one of the big things about Old Testament laws is they're built up so that there aren't grudges. And this is atrocious. Again, there's, really terrible things in the Bible. And that doesn't mean the Bible's evil. It doesn't mean God's evil. But like it's a story of essentially how terrible we can be to each other. Most of, even Hammurabi's code, the idea of like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life, these things are at least a step better than genocidal grudges. Or like stuff, because genocide also comes into the Bible, and it's essentially for the same reason. Again, I'm not saying a lot of this is like pretty or like even definite answers or anything, but what is the reason why Japan is so is such an honor-bound, polite culture? Well, it's because you got so many people like living in a really densely populated area. Similar thing with the Middle East. Like, you have honor codes so that people don't end up in homicidal rages that then lead to huge grudges breaking out. There's a story later in Genesis. The 12 sons of Israel, they have a sister named Dinah who is captured and raped by a neighboring tribe person. And the affront, this gets into our like second major issue of patriarchy, the affront is not to Dinah, it's not to the woman, it is to the family as like she being their property. It's a serious affront, but the issue is not the honor of the woman, it is the honor of the men in the family and their property. What essentially happens is the brothers destroy this whole town in a kind of underhanded, like, cut off all their foreskins because they say they want to be included into the tribe and therefore follow all the rules. And so they're all circumcised, and while they're weak and stuff, the brothers, like, slaughter the whole family. It's this type of escalation that the Hammurabi Code and all sorts of things, like, and many of the laws in the Old Testament are specifically against. And there's other ways that, like, no, of course it's not great for right now. But, I mean, and feel free, I mean, these are just, like, my ideas and stuff, but, I studied theater in college, and there was a point at which, like, segregation, racism things were happening. I don't mean to demean that by being flippant or anything, it's just how I talk, but, so there was a point at which there were certain theater shows that, certain theater companies, certain genres of theater that allowed people of color into the theater. And they had to pay a certain price to stand in the back. So, by no means is that, like, good by our standards. And we certainly aren't, like, enlightened or better in every way. As a close friend of mine was talking about, like, the distinction between, like, the prison system now is not necessarily just a straight improvement from the system of slavery before. Like, some things are better, some things are worse. In a similar way, like, some things are better with the way we treat foreigners or people of color or minorities or anything like that. And having an incremental step better is probably a good thing. So, that was a big digression. So all that to say, like, hospitality is critically important. And there's a language for it, right? Both Abraham and Lot, and to some extent even this guy hundreds of years later in the book of Judges, uses the same language. They see a situation where there's some foreigner who needs help, assistance, whatever, and they get up, they run, they call them Lord, they say, I am your servant, they give them food and water, they wash their feet. That's pretty consistent. There's even parts of that idea, like, that go on now in the Middle East. So that's what we're talking about. Blah, 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 blah. So, moving on, the idea of the people who come and, like, knock down the door and say, like, we want to have sex with these people. It says in verse 4, surrounded by the men of the town, the men of Sodom, young and old, all people without exception. Is this an entire town of homosexual people? No. I mean, if for no other reason than the fact that, like, the same thing happens later in Judges, and it says a similar thing, like, a whole bunch of people. And in this case, it's not the whole town, but are these people gay? Are they attracted to men and want to have sex with them? No, I mean, in the case of the Judges story, they also have no problem having sex with a woman. Now, it's debatable. Rape is not sex. It is a disgusting power play of control. So, is it possible that, like, there's an entire town of... And Lot, like, even if the men of Sodom didn't have sex with any women in this instance, Lot seems to think that it's worth a shot. And so is there an entire town of bisexual people? Like, no. There's even fewer bisexual people statistically, or fewer bisexual men by our understanding. But the concept of, like, an innate, unchangeable orientation was simply not something that existed in the ancient times. Some people can argue this. There's some Aristotelian theology, but this is, like, early Genesis. Like, there's no philosophy of the time that talks about, like, people who are innately and concisely homosexual. So we're already, like, not talking about that. We're also not talking about love. We're talking about a power play that is obviously based on foreignness, right? In both stories, we have a story of a foreigner who knows the rules of hospitality better than the people in that town. And that is what reveals the town's wickedness, essentially. They even say, they replied, "Out of the way, here is one who came as a foreigner and would set himself up as a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them." Aye. I mean, they say their motive right there, that they want to abuse foreigners, not men. I might as well jump to way into the Bible. Book right before Revelation is Jude. It's only one chapter. Verse 7 says, the fornication of Sodom and Gomorrah... Okay, I guess I should have some context. "I would like to remind you, though, that you have already learned it once for all, and for all." This is verse 5. "How the Lord rescued the nation from Egypt." So this is a thing that Jews like to do a lot throughout the Bible, is remind people of their history. So, why don't we do the same thing? "But afterwards he still destroyed the men who did not trust him." So God destroyed the people who didn't trust God after getting them out of Egypt. "Next, let me remind you of the angels who had supreme authority but did not keep it after they left their appointed sphere." So this is a reference to earlier in Genesis, like Genesis chapter 7 and stuff, with the Nephilim. Like, this is an apocryphal, related to some apocryphal stories. Jude is almost an apocryphal book. That means a book that really it's debatable as to its source, either from its, like, time of when it was written, or and obviously it was included in the Bible. That's good enough for me. But everything should be up for question. Anyway, so like, angels came down and had sex with women, and there were these Nephilim, these, like, giants, these, like, heroes, powerful people. And that was obviously a really bad thing, bad enough for God to, like, destroy the whole world over it, in the flood and stuff. So the angels left their appointed sphere. "He has kept them down in the dark," so demons, "in spiritual chains to be judged on the great day." Verse 7, "The fornication of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other towns nearby was equally unnatural." So this is an important word. "And it was a warning to us that they are paying for their crimes in eternal fire." So there's some hell concepts here, which is fun to discover. I'm not going to dive into, like, hell theory and things, although it's fascinating. So then it says, "Nevertheless, these people are doing the same," which is, by the way, the exact same, like, linguistic pattern that you find from, like, Romans chapter 1 to chapter 2, is arguably people are talking about this, like, gay thing, but it's not. And then it says, "You therefore are doing the same thing." I digress. So the word unnatural. In this case, this word is heteros sarkos in Greek. Hetero, as in like the root of heterosexual, like different sexual attraction. Sarkos means flesh. Unnatural desire, unnatural flesh. So this is actually making a comment. I mean, it's debatable, but like, this is making a comment based on the connection to the Nephilim and angels and humans having sex with angels thing, that the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah was not actually related to the fact that these people looked like men, but the fact that they were angels, and that these people wanted to have unnatural, as in like spiritual, sex. Now, I think that's an odd interpretation. It's already like many, many hundreds of years past the initial incident. Although they had been kept reading, like Jews had been kept reading about this for obviously their whole time. The ideas even about like what Sodom and Gomorrah means changed throughout history. But this one, even the Bible here is like referencing this idea of, people have pointed out to me like, oh look, like here's another thing that says what Sodom and Gomorrah did was unnatural. The word pretty clearly, in the context of the thing, pretty clearly states that the issue, the reason it was unnatural, was not actually connected to what Paul writes about as unnatural in Romans and some other places, like having long hair. That the reason it was unnatural was because it was literally like supernatural, like breaking spiritual boundaries and things. So that was, an interpretation of Genesis things. Going back. So back to this is maybe the biggest thing of Sodom and Gomorrah. All of that is really like tangential. The really big problematic part of this story, to me, that the Bible doesn't even seem to go into, is the way that they treat women. Blah. Let me say some stuff about levirate marriage. So levirate marriage was a form of marriage that was used in that, like, evidently God or maybe Moses or whatever prescribed for women whose husband died and left them without a male heir. So these women, if they had only had daughters or they didn't have any kids or whatever, these women would have to have sex with the brothers, her husband's next brother, in order to have a male heir. There's a story about this later, and it actually is included in the New Testament. This woman is one of the ancestors of Jesus. In the story of Onan, yes, so this woman married this dude, and God killed, or he died, or God killed him, or something, because he was bad. And so she, by levirate marriage, needed the next son, and he also died. Sorry, there's so much history in the Bible, and this is like a kind of obscure story. So Tamar, I think it was Tamar, married the oldest son, and God killed him, or he died, or something. And Onan then needed to, like, it was his responsibility to give her a male heir. And he had sex with her, but then not wanting to split his property, or maybe wanting to take advantage of her again and again, withdrew and ejaculated on the ground. And some people use that as like a stupid argument for no masturbation. I think that's ridiculous. There's like Catholic ideas of procreation and how that's essential to marriage and stuff. And I think procreation is beautiful and important. It's also not what that story is talking about. It's talking about women's rights, essentially. So then this guy... So God kills Onan. Not as, like... I mean, that's a pretty severe reaction. And it's because he's refusing to take care of a vulnerable person. So she dresses up like... Oh, no, sorry. History. So, her father-in-law has one more son, who's kind of young at the time, and he's like, you're, like, somehow killing all my sons. So you probably shouldn't have my son. But the excuse he says is, oh, like, he's just too young right now. And so when he is older, this boy grows up and still has, like, a moral responsibility to Tamar, and the father, like, backs out of this deal. Kind of Rumpelstiltskin style. Maybe. Who knows? And so she dresses up like a prostitute to ensnare him. He falls for it. And she, like, very cleverly, like, keeps his ring to prove that it was him. So when she's pregnant, people were like, oh, you're, like, this woman in your family, like, was a prostitute. Like, you should kill her. And so he does, and then she's like, whose ring is this? And he's like, oh, it's mine. I'm worse. I'm in the wrong, and you're in the right. So, like, premarital sex was less of an issue. And, like, this being, like, was, like, less of an issue than his lack of, than his, like, not fulfilling his duty to her. So she then has a boy and everything's fine. Is it fine? No. By, like, our own standards, that system is terrible. But at the time, because women weren't valued enough to, like, have ways to support themselves, like, they needed God to, like, take care of them in that way. I mean, were there other ways around it? Maybe. Would they have worked in that culture? Probably not. It's a tough thing. I'm not saying this is, like, the best answer, or, well, whatever. It's just really tough, and a lot of it's really gross. All of that goes to point to the fact that women were not respected or valued in this society. And, you know, these stories where it's like, oh, like, what if you rape this woman instead? As if that's a better option. They literally say, like, value systems, like, oh, don't do this horrible thing to this man. Like, it's better with this woman. So that's the context of Sodom and Gomorrah. Is there anything else there? No, not really. Oh, there's a verse in Ezekiel. I think it's 16:49. Isaiah? Where the heck is Ezekiel? Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry, my Bible has some apocryphal books like Baruch after Lamentations. Ezekiel 16:49. Here we go. This is also important. I'm glad I found it. Okay, let's just start with some context. Let's go back. Ezekiel's a prophet. He's talking to Israel now with the voice of God. Starting at 44, Ezekiel 16:44, we'll go a little bit past that. Now, all the proverb makers will make a proverb about you, like mother, like daughter. Yes, you are a true daughter of your mother, who hated her husband and her children, a true sister of your sisters, who hated their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father was an Amorite. Wow, that's racist. I'd have to look back. There's a weird, like, ending to the Sodom and Gomorrah story because Lot's daughters are upset at not having children, so they actually, like, get their father drunk and have sex with him to have sons by him, and they, like, become the father of, I think, the Ammonites, whatever it is, who eventually, I think, God, like, destroys. So, important big stuff. Anyway, kind of a Monty Python-esque, your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries. Or your mother was a hamster, father, whatever. Anyway, I can't keep all of these things in my head, guys. So, your elder sister is Samaria, who lives, so all of this is, like, again, kind of racist, which isn't great, who lives on your left on your left. So that's, you know, left-handedness is also, like, so now they're dissing left-handed people. Like, this is the word of God. Is God dissing left-handed people? Is God dissing Ammonites or Amorites? And this is complex, y'all. Okay. Your younger sister is Sodom, who lives on your right. Oh, maybe it's just a geographical reference. Sorry for the diatribe. Maybe God's not insulting. But there's other stuff. In fact, actually, okay, so left-handedness, there's one story in the Bible about left-handedness. There's a prophet, maybe he's a judge, actually. And there's this mean king who's fat. Nothing against fat people. The Bible's not, like... Anyway. There's this mean king, and there's a prophet who is left-handed, and oftentimes people, like, they like, would keep a sword here, so that right-handed they'd be like, ha, stab. This guy is left-handed, so he kept his sword here, and he would be like, oh, stab. Now, left-handed people are less common, and so the guards who were letting him in to see this king didn't check his right thigh. And so he got in with a knife and he stabbed this dude. And the story is he's so fat that he, like, the sword, like, went into the... it makes wonderful youth group skits. And then he poops himself. So, anyway, I think it's the Jehovah's Witness who say that if there's any, it's kind of a sola scriptura idea, like if there's anything in the Bible that like is represented poorly, like we don't believe in it. So birthdays are typically actually not represented particularly well in the Bible. John the Baptist was killed for Herod's birthday party, or yeah, and so they don't celebrate birthdays. But left-handedness is okay because there's one verse about it that says it's like that God used it in a good way. I think that's kind of a silly view of like what Scripture is, or at least it's like a restricted view. Back to Ezekiel. Sorry. You have not failed. Okay, your younger sister is Sodom, who lives on your right, with her daughters. You have not failed to copy their behavior. Throughout your career, you have shown yourself corrupt as they were. As I live, it is the Lord Yahweh who speaks. Your sister Sodom and her daughters have not been as bad as you and your daughters. The crime of your sister Sodom was pride, gluttony, arrogance, complacency. Such were the sins of Sodom. I'm going to read that again. Sorry, because it was too fast. For me, even. The crime of your sister Sodom was pride, gluttony, arrogance, complacency. Such were the sins of Sodom and her daughters. They never helped the poor and needy. They were proud and engaged in filthy practices in front of me. That is why I have swept them away as you have seen. And yet Samaria has never committed half the crimes that you have. So a couple verses later, it actually says, I will restore them. I will restore Sodom and her daughters. But a couple comments about this. So, first of all, Sodom is described as a woman here. So this is far from like the homosexual kind of connotation. This is going to be a long video. I forgot how complex this story was. So every time that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is brought up in the Bible itself, it is brought up with this connotation to inhospitality and gluttony even. So ancient cultures held this idea of another digression. This one's important about ancient ideas of homosexuality. Ancient cultures held this idea that if you like ate too much spicy food, or if like you got too excited, you might accidentally do something gay, or maybe like try to do something gay just to like keep your life exciting. Which I think that's a hilarious view. There's an ancient Egyptian like marriage code, and this copies over into some other ancient cultures. There's a law that says a husband will bring home neither his male nor his female lover. And it just presupposes, there's some Greek stuff that just like Roman stuff that just presupposes that people might, kind of just do a gay thing every once in a while. So, I mean, it kind of, everyone is bi in their view. And that the idea of it came from just being bored, essentially. There's a lot of Roman Greek stuff that's like, hey, they got excited or drunk or something. So that's how gluttony like relates to this idea of homosexuality at all. Maybe Sodom was doing like gay things, but even if they were, like, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19 isn't about that. and it wasn't the reason God like killed people. Some people view like, oh, maybe it's just like this stacking of sins, like they were hospitable and they were gay, and so that's why it was such like this flaming fire and brimstone punishment. I think that's silly, even if, again, it has nothing to do with like homosexual attraction or love. There is no socially acceptable. I mean, even in the U.S., like until a little while ago, in most of human culture, there is no socially acceptable way to have loving, consensual, legal gay sex. Like, people complain about gay people, like, not being married. And so, like, all gay sex, until it was legal, was outside of the covenant of marriage. Well, that's a double standard. If you couldn't get married, then all of your sex is outside of marriage. But that doesn't mean it's not committed. Most gay sex, and this will come back, I'll talk about this again when we talk about Romans and the New Testament, but it's relevant in all of these, that the act of sex and power in the ancient world was viewed as who was penetrating and who was penetrated. That was way more important, and what is their individual power structure? That was way more important than whether they were male or female. If they were male, this gets back to like this patriarchy thing. If they were male, it was shame to them. Leviticus will talk about. Maybe I should save this for the Leviticus passage because this one's getting long. But Leviticus talks about kill both the receiver and the giver in that situation, and again, that's actually a like form of justice. Like if a person, because the typical only form of acceptable gay sex, or not even acceptable, would have been as a form of idolatry, demon worship, or as a form of like rape. So the Jews went one farther and said, hey, it was like you're shameful for having like been raped, which is a messed up idea. But also they punished the perpetrator of that, which may not be the worst idea in the world. But the crime is bigger than having raped a woman because you've turned a man into a woman by their social standards. That was a big digression. I might bring it back up when we get to Leviticus because it's important there too. But we're talking about other times Sodom and Gomorrah came into the story. So most of the time the Bible references Sodom and Gomorrah, it's about this like pride, gluttony idea. It does say filthy practices. It doesn't specify gay stuff. Same language. We'll get to like the abomination word when we get to Leviticus. But that's not enough to. I mean, I'm not making like a complete argument here, but like a guess as to what a word might mean is not enough to like convict and call all homosexual love sinful for the rest of eternity. Okay, so even Jesus talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, and what's the context he talks about it in? Nothing to do with sex, nothing to do with like he sends out the disciples, the 72 and the 12 and whatever, and he says, if there's a city that doesn't welcome you, shake the dust of your feet off your sandals, and it'll be worse for them than the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because they didn't welcome you. Last final thoughts about Sodom and Gomorrah. The first person to like connect it to anything inherently like sexual or gay was Josephus in I think like the 3rd century. There was someone who like brought it up in the 3rd century BC, but the idea didn't really catch on. It did catch on in the 3rd century AD, and then it like stuck. And largely I think that's due to Roman cultural perceptions after and the demonization of Roman and Greek practices once Christianity was more accepted as the main state religion. But it wasn't like in the 1100s there was a monk who created the word sodomy, and what he meant by that was any non-procreative sex, so oral sex, or like manual manipulation. I'm trying to keep it a little bit tame here or whatever. Like, those would both have been considered sodomy at that time. Even sex with statues. Like, he clarifies a whole category of sex with statues, as sodomy. And he says it as a form of rebuke to the monks and priests who are doing bad things at the time. This is related to early Catholic ideas then about priests. Early Catholic. I don't want to like throw Catholics under the bus for no reason or at all really. But the idea of like priests not having kids is weird, and it's not biblical. Because it leads to anyway. The word then changed throughout the centuries, and eventually in England and stuff came to mean the like buggery laws. That's when it explicitly was connected to anal sex, and beyond that, like male anal sex. And there were laws passed against it, and those laws, because of imperialism and colonialism, got broadcast through much of Africa and many other places. Like, these places weren't necessarily like homophobic before. Maybe they were, but they probably weren't. And now we're all dealing with the implications of that. So, thanks. So, like, in the 50s even, like, these laws were still around in the U.S., and people were, like, it was illegal. And there's a lovely book called Walking the Bridgeless Canyon by Kathy Baldock, which covers, like, the modern historical and some of the old historical interpretations of the word sodomy and things. But, like, biblically speaking, it wasn't connected really to anything with sex, and it certainly wasn't connected to anything with gay sex, and it certainly wasn't ever connected to anything with attraction. So, that was the Sodom and Gomorrah thing. In essence, that's kind of one of the hardest ones to, like, it's obviously one of the least, like, relevant, but it's one of the most common to, like, bring up, and it's just complex of how to, like, understand it appropriately. And it reveals to us the type of work that we need to do for the rest of all of this time. I'm sure there's stuff that I missed out. I'm sure there's stuff that I should have put in the Leviticus passages, but there we go. I think that's everything related to Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, see you next time on part 3 of Byron, Queer Theology 101.